Okay, I think it's recording. Okay, so I did Unix version 6. It's a fairly old version of Unix back from 1975. This was one of the first versions of Unix. It was the first version of Unix that was released to the public, but it cost something like $30,000 to actually have implemented. So it was open source in a way. Not No, it wasn't open source because it was more similar to how Microsoft does theirs, except way more expensive. It was designed for mini computers like the DEC PDP-11 family of mini computers. These computers were fairly wide used, well, relatively wide used in higher up computer organizations, such as you could probably see it in the military, as well as any kind of systems that might have worked for the government. So you have information centers or data collection agencies. So like I said, the OS was released in 1975, which was the same year as the Altair 8800 microcomputer, which was shown in Electronics magazine to the public, which in turn started up the evolution of the microcomputer. And of course, that developed and developed into what we have now. The kernel for said operating system, I couldn't exactly pinpoint if it was a microkernel or not, but I could see that it had more simple uses since it wasn't a microcomputer. Um, this OS had at least a couple versions before it, which was what was it called? Never mind. But the versions, so the sixth version here ended up actually being the one that would lead on to version 7, and that one was the predecessor to the L3 microkernel and the L4 microkernel, which are used in Linux. Now, not the same, but very similar. It was very useful in the creation of Linux, at least its use of microkernels. And the only reason why that is because I couldn't pinpoint it was due to the term microkernel wasn't invented yet for at that time, so you couldn't use it for something like that. But the so let's go to the GUI. Since there wasn't one, there was a user interface, but nothing. There was no graphics, so it was very blank. It was your normal command line use for a user interface. Used specifically the Thompson shell. This shell was the first Unix shell that Unix ever used. So even though it was the sixth version, they were still using the same shell. It still had that iconic black background. No pictures. The command line interfaces are, as most of them are. And like I said, this was the beginning, basically, of Unix command line. And then having any kind of command line, in this system, it was used to run processes quicker. And since it's a command line, didn't have to go through any GUI steps. So there's no clicking, no nothing. It was all your basic, probably what you would use in Linux administration classes. But since this OS was for a microcomputer, there was no need for a GUI. So, because no one's going to be touching it like your common, let's say me, I would not be walking into a computer station in 1975 being like, oh, let me go look up something. Because that wasn't a thing. So people who did use it, they didn't need a GUI. They had what they needed. They knew how the command line worked. And that was their lifestyle. And then the security. Unix has had the same security for a long time. It's based on 12-bit sequence, has 9 permission bits, a user ID bits, or a couple user ID bits, and a sticky bit. The 9 are divided into 3 groups, 3 bits each. The first is permissions of the file owner. Second is group permissions. The third has to do with root access, so core files. And that is Unix version 6.